Here's one in our own backyard, the famous Cash Landrum UFO encounter that occurred up near Denton, Texas, and ultimately which had an Austin connection by way of Bergstrom Air Force Base. This is an infamous case where the two women you see there and the grandson, Colby Landrum, were driving home one evening and were confronted by this flaming diamond-shaped object that was hovering over the road. Later on, it was determined that there was some damage to the road by the intense heat given off by this object. And in fact, both ladies experienced health effects that seemed to be directly the result of their close encounter with this phenomenon. Now, the thing that makes this a little more complicated is the fact that they claim to have seen up to 23, I believe, Chinook helicopters. For those that are familiar with helicopters, the Chinooks are these giant troop transport helicopters. They have two blades. They're massive helicopters, and they say that that these helicopters were pinning the object in and seemingly trying to corral it away. In fact, there were other UFO sightings that night that described a similar object, and there were other people that witnessed those helicopters. Now, they tried to sue. The UFO lawyer, Peter Gersten, took on the case. They tried to sue the U.S. government. Unfortunately, they lost. Basically, that case was heard here in Austin at Bergstrom Air Force Base. It was investigated by John Schuessler, who would go on to become the head of MUFON for a while. It was also investigated by non-lethal weapons expert and thanatologist John Alexander. But unfortunately, I think it's Vicky, the grandmother, passed away probably due to the radiation sickness that she suffered. Now, this is just an example of the kind of thing that I would say if you do see a UFO, keep in mind you may not want to get that close to it. And to drive home that fact, here's something a lot of people don't know about, and that's the FEMA Firefighter's Guide to Disaster Control, Lucky 13, Chapter 13, called Enemy Attack and UFO Potential. This is a very strange place for UFO information to be found, but actually it makes a lot of sense. I think I first heard about this back in 1995, and it's sent every few years. The media gets a hold of this knowledge and does little local news reports. But interestingly enough, they actually allude to Jacques Vallée's research in one of his most important books, The Invisible College. And they talk about the fact that he cautions we should consider psychic effects, such as space-time distortions experienced by percipients of craft-like devices, which appear to fade away, dematerialize, and then reappear, of alien strange voices, or thoughts that may affect involuntary changes in the manner in which witnesses may react in such circumstances. Now, the chapter is much longer than that, obviously, and goes into much more detail, but they start off by focusing on the radiation effects, but then again, they mention these other more psychic effects. It's kind of a strange place for that. Now, a good example of investigating from both a physical and psychical perspective is Ray Stanford. Ray Stanford was the brother of Rex Stanford, two twins who had a history in the early contactee era of UFOs. In fact, in another book of Vallée's called Messengers of Deception, he talked about their affiliation with various contactee cults that were here in Texas during the 1950s and 60s. Now, one of the things people don't often realize is that Ray Stanford was the organizer of one of the most instrumented civilian scientific efforts to research UFOs that's ever occurred. Just outside of Austin, he had a small piece of land that had been donated to him by a local fellow, and they put there, as you see in that picture, a lot of, at the time, pretty high-tech equipment. They had a computer, they had laser magnetometers, ELF meters, radar, a lot of different equipment, and it was all linked in such a way so that even when they weren't there, it was monitoring the skies And if a possible UFO tripped the magnetometer or the ELF meter, the computer would automatically call one of their representatives, one of their investigators that was in the part of Austin where they might be best able to view such a UFO. Now, that's pretty amazing. Nobody's really done this since. You know, there's organizations like MUFON and CUFOS and FUFOR and all the other American UFO groups, but nobody's reproduced this kind of research yet. And if you know, the way Ray Stanford tells it, he's got hundreds, thousands of photographs of various UFOs that they recorded at the PSI, Project Starlight International, here in Austin, Texas. Now, unfortunately, none of that has ever been published. And a few years ago, or I guess it was a decade ago now, I had the pleasure of hanging out with Mr. Stanford for a whole day and really just listened to him tell tales about the classic saucer era, the contactees. And he's pretty opinionated of himself, but he does seem to have accomplished quite a bit. He was a respected artist. He was a known psychic. He was doing channeling. That was where the psychical part comes in. Besides PSI, he had this other organization going on at the same time, AUM, the Association for the Understanding of Man, where he would do sittings and he would channel material from various higher intelligences, and kind of had a little group going there. In fact, the Austin MUFON group, from what I've heard, was kind of an outgrowth of this. But eventually it all disbanded, and again, that material has never been published, and unfortunately I think it's because he really wants a lot of money for it. And I don't criticize him for that, but I'm also of the opinion that, you know, this is potentially a boon to science and humanity, and it should be out there for us to look over and to research, but he doesn't seem to want to get rid of it. But he also published some interesting books, Fatima Prophecy, Discover the Message and Meaning of Fatima. Fatima was a very famous case of a recurring luminous phenomena that was interpreted in a religious mold and happened like every month, and more thousands and then tens of thousands of people came every month to see this thing. And it's a very interesting case because it seems to exemplify one aspect of the phenomena that we'll be touching on later, that's a ball of light, basically, when experienced up close, often can be perceived as, in that image on the cover there, as something like the Blessed Virgin Mary. But the farther away you get, it doesn't seem, the witnesses don't seem to always see the same thing, as if their distance, besides just the object or the light being that much further away, there seems to be some other factor there that affects the perception of the witnesses. He also published a very funnily named book called Socorro Saucer in a Pentagon Pantry. And if you're familiar with the Socorro, New Mexico UFO incident, it was not a saucer. It was an egg-shaped craft that was described by Lonnie Zamora, a policeman who witnessed it take off after seeing small beings. But that was a pretty important book because Ray managed to get some metal samples from the indentations of the landed egg-shaped craft, and he tried to get them into the hands of government scientists, and then the samples disappeared. Kind of classic, actually. Let's see. All right. So again, there's different ways of approaching this phenomena. You can approach it from, I'm just going to collect UFO reports. I'm going to, investigate close encounters and try to get physical traces. And in fact, that's one of the best people to do that kind of research is Ted Phillips. In that picture there, Ted's a young man being schooled by his mentor, J. Allen Hynek, as I said, the grandfather of ufology. Ted Phillips went on to create the Center for Physical Trace Research. Now, if you're interested in the absolute best physical scientific evidence for UFOs, he's your guy. He continues to do phenomenal research. He's actually gotten some attention recently on some of the cable UFO shows, but that's his one specialty. He doesn't really get into abductions. He doesn't get into all the other areas that one would think all ufologists are into, alien contact. Kind of on the other end of the spectrum is Ray White. Now, Ray was kind of part of the inspiration for me to form the Anomaly Archives. She started off as a parapsychologist. She wanted to use science to try to understand these strange phenomena like ESP, telepathy, and whatnot. But eventually, she became dissatisfied with that kind of rigid scientific approach. As much as parapsychology has accomplished, she felt it really wasn't the best way to go. And so she formed the Exceptional Human Experience Network, EHEN, because she started focusing on these experiences as exactly that, exceptional human experiences. And so she really went just almost like more of an anthropological perspective. Like she just started collecting people's stories of strange experiences and trying to categorize them and just collect them in general. Now, she passed away a few years ago, unfortunately, and now her phenomenally large collection of reports and data is in the hands of the Parapsychology Foundation, which is a pretty cool research organization in New York City. Now, the last person I have on this slide is Jerome Clark, who I've mentioned previously. Now, Clark is interesting because he's really regarded as like the current preeminent ufologist, and especially when it comes to the history of UFOs. He started off kind of like me in that he really became enamored with people like Jacques Vallée and John Keel. He really liked the idea of the paranormal explanations for UFOs and not necessarily an extraterrestrial interpretation. But as he researched that more and more, he came to feel that that just wasn't accurate, wasn't true. He pretty much went back to being a hardcore nuts and bolts kind of guy, believing that UFOs are best understood in terms of the extraterrestrial hypothesis, the ETH. But recently, he's kind of come almost full circle, except that he's not so much espousing a paranormal or parapsychological perspective as kind of a perspective like Ray White's. He's now using the phrase experience anomalies. He recently received the 2008 Dinsdale Award from the Society for Scientific Exploration, which is one of the few, if only, peer-reviewed scientific journals, scientific organizations investigating UFOs and anomalous phenomenon. And in his acceptance speech, he gave his presentation on his idea about experience anomalies. He's also recently had it published in Fortean Times, which is a really awesome magazine devoted to Fortean phenomenon.